be taking a look at 5 crosses today. And the first cross is called the Romero cross, and it is a cross full of the colors of South America. It is a cross designed to remind us of Saint Oscar Romero, who died while performing Mass at a church. Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador was shot while he was saying Mass on the 24th of March in 1980. At the time, his country was governed by the wealthy, who were oppressing the poorest with help from the army. Thousands were imprisoned, tortured, murdered, or simply disappeared. Romero denounced the violence in his Sunday sermons, which were broadcast by radio, and he became known as a voice for the voiceless. The people who followed him helped to fund the rebuilding of his radio station when it was bombed by those who did not want to have his voice be heard. Romero knew that his life was under threat, and a few days before he died, he said, "If I am killed, I will rise again in the Salvadorian people." After Romero's death, many of the ordinary people of El Salvador began calling him Saint Romero and came to his tomb to pray. In February of 2015, Pope Francis declared that Romero was a martyr. This meant that he would become known as the Blessed Oscar Romero, the first step in being officially declared a saint. So in El Salvador, there's a tradition of producing very colorful crucifixes. The bright decorations not only have a figure of Jesus at the center, but also include images of the local community set in a Salvadorian landscape. So this design is produced by the Center for Oscar Romero, and it's become known worldwide throughout the world as the Romero cross. And I begin with it because it shows the vibrancy, the colors, the hosannas that we just celebrated, what it means to be alive. I also believe that this cross represents the revolution. In the scripture that we begin with, it talks about how a man called Barabbas was imprisoned with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. Barabbas was a revolutionary. He, unlike Jesus, was a violent revolutionary. He felt that the way to achieve freedom was through violence and overthrowing the Roman occupation. And he was arrested for murdering Roman citizens and soldiers. And so, in today's scripture, we have this contrast between the violent murderer, the revolutionary Jesus Barabbas, and Jesus the Christ, who is the non-violent revolutionary. And it's interesting to me in this scripture that the crowd would rather choose Jesus Barabbas rather than Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, as the one to save. But I think it makes sense because of the cultural norms, that we believe that when it's time to take control of things, we need someone who's going to be the clear leader, who's going to give us victory. And the people see that getting Jesus Barabbas back, he can re-enter the troops' ranks and bring those troops back to cohesion so that they can then uprise again and again. They would much rather have the violent revolutionary who will lead them into battle and give them victory than the man who refuses to pick up a sword and fight. And so Pontius Pilate releases for them the man of violence rather than the man of peace. And so the man of peace is executed. May the cross of Oscar Romero remind us that even in the midst of injustice and the world choosing violence over non-violence, there is still hope and vibrancy which exists to this day in El Salvador and in the Center for Oscar Romero and in the crosses, the Oscar Romero crosses that hang throughout the world. Our second cross is a cross that we can call the cross of liberation the cross of poverty. It is featured on the cover of Gustavo Gutierrez's book, Theology of Liberation. And there is little information I could find about the cross, but it is most likely made in South America, where there is an incredible amount of poverty. And the anguish that we see in this figure of Jesus can be felt in witnessing his poverty and connecting it with this scripture. Gustavo Gutierrez was a Peruvian philosopher, theologian, and Dominican Catholic priest regarded as one of the founders of liberation theology, something that we would consider part of our modern theologies, which would be liberation theology, talking about the poor and how we are called out of oppression. Black theology is another theology that emerges out of these modern theologies. Feminist theology or womanist theologies, those different circles of theologies. And we look at what Gustavo Gutierrez has brought to us in his academic study and his work in Peru. He was instrumental in really trying to formulate an understanding of the Latin American reality that he witnessed. And that became the driving force of his own vision of liberation theology. He said, "I come from a continent in which more than 60% of the population lives in a state of poverty. And 82% of those find themselves in extreme poverty." So Gutierrez has focused his efforts on the rediscovery of love thy neighbor as the central axiom of Christian life. As outlined in his thesis and book, Towards a Theology of Liberation, he cites on multiple occasions Vatican II's Gaudium et Spes and Paul VI, Populorum Progressio. To Gutierrez, the source of the problems of Latin America was the sin manifested in an unjust social structure. So his solution to this problem was to emphasize the dignity of the poor by prioritizing the glory of God found in them, present in all of us. In this scripture reading, where Christ is finally put on the cross, he would have carried the crossbeam in the historical Roman archives that we understand what crucifixion would have been. He would not have carried the whole post, but just the crossbeam. And when he got to the top of the hill, they would have put him up on the crossbeam. Often, crucifixion was upside down, and the purpose of that was to let your lungs struggle, and then you would actually suffocate. It wasn't an easy death, and it was long and torturous. In the scripture, it says that he was hung between two bandits. Why bandits? Why would you turn to a life of thievery? Because you are poor. Because the society in which you live does not recognize the gifts that you have that will help produce your own way of income or way of living. And so the result is there's not enough, so you seek out taking what it is you need. And then that in itself can turn into a sin of greed and overconsumption. Why bandits? Poverty. And here at the foot of Christ, the Roman soldiers cast lots. And they divide whatever precious belongings Jesus has left, which is a cloth, which is whatever might have been strapped around his waist. It is nothing, and yet in that act, Jesus is robbed of almost everything. In Gustavo Gutierrez's Cross of Liberation, though, we see the power of the poor present. That there's much the world can take from us, but the world cannot take who God has made us to be. We are, in fact, God's own precious children. And that Guterres is enough. Our third cross is a cross of darkness, and I selected the cross that is depicted here. It's called the Black Christ. And in this 1920s lithograph image, you see a crucified Christ in the background on a cross. And below it, a bending tree with a black figure lynched. This is a powerful image. And I think about what it means to stumble upon the darkness. What happens when these little acts of unkindness, when the things that cut and hurt us in small ways suddenly become the great evil, the darkness, the ways in which so many suffer and what we could ultimately call evil. The Black Christ was illustrated by Charles Cullen, and the book that it is found in is a book of poetry by County Cullen. And County Cullen was one of the leading poets and intellects of the Harlem Renaissance. The book of poetry, published at the height of his career, examines the relationships between faith and injustice. Cullen draws parallels between the suffering of the crucified Christ and the suffering of African Americans in the climate of racial violence that characterized the 1920s. This is County Cullen's poem, The Black Christ. God's glory and my country's shame, and how one man who cursed Christ's name may never fully expiate the crime till at the blessed gates of heaven he meet and pardon me out of his love and charity. How God, who needs no man's applause, for love of my stark soul of flaws, composed, seeing it slip, did stoop down so the mire and pick me up, and in the hollow of his hand enact again at my command the world's supermost tragedy. Until I die my burden be, how Calvary and Palestine, extending down to me and mine, was but the first leaf in a line of trees on which a man should swing, world without end in suffering, for all men's healing, let me sing. The richness that is found in this volume of work, The Black Christ, is astounding, and it is a treasure to remind us that God's worth is found in all people. Yes, even in our suffering, even in the world's greatest evils that have ever been committed, we find that there is still grace for all. May we never forget the evils that are perpetrated. May we continue to always, always work at addressing the injustices of the world. Our fourth cross is this photo here of a crucifix. It is Jesus as a woman hanging on the cross. This was displayed in a Catholic church for a very brief time before the Catholic authorities asked for it to be removed. It was disgraceful. And it is now on display in a museum after being hidden for about 30 years. Theologically and historically indefensible. That's how the Bishop Walter Dennis described this bronze sculpture of Christ as a nude woman in 1984. It is about 4 foot tall, 250 pounds, and it was hung in New York's Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine. Although thanks to the bishop and many hate mail, it was only there briefly. and after an aggressive backlash, the sculpture was packed up and shipped out as soon as it arrived. So over 30 years, its removal is now making a grand return. This crucifix, this cross, is called Christa. British artist Edwina Sandys is the daughter of Winston Churchill. And she first molded this contentious form out of clay in 1974 in London. She said, while she was hit with inspiration, "I thought, what should I be doing today? Oh, I know. I'll do a female Christ." It really just happened more or less automatically. The statue, which only took days to complete, was cast and then put into heavier bronze. And Sandys, who was at time was friendly with the dean of the cathedral church, asked if they'd be interested in mounting the sculpture. Almost as a dare, she put it, and the rector of the church said yes. Although Sandy did not intend the work to be specifically in conversation with the women's liberation and women's rights movements of the 1970s, she knew the piece spoke directly to women in a variety of ways. In many ways that the religion did not. "I wanted to portray the suffering of women," she said in an interview. She continued to describe how, although the work is undoubtedly feminist, she hopes to appeal to both men and women in equalizing the portrayal of suffering. So often we see that men are the ones who are suffering. They're the ones out looking for jobs. They're the breadwinners bringing home the money. They're out toiling in the fields and working difficult hours. Her intention is to remind us that all God's people suffer and struggle. And when we put that image before us, it helps us understand that God made us both, women and men, female and male, that God is present in both and all. When we think about the suffering of women, the suffering that often gets buried or becomes politicized, the suffering of childbearing and labor, the suffering of caring for family in perhaps a 1950s kind of sense of the way of being, the suffering of finding fair and equal pay for work, the suffering for finding a position of leadership. To this date, our country still has not had a female president. There is suffering that gets buried, and by bringing it out into the open, we hope to bear witness to it. May your suffering not get buried for 30 years because it is theologically and historically indefensible. God proclaims that all God's people in their suffering will find grace and mercy and peace. And that is what I hope that you will find in this depiction of Christa, the female Christ, on the cross. To the ending of a long and difficult day. A day that perhaps begins with joy but ends in deep and abiding sorrow. Our fifth cross, you will notice that there are 4 pictures here. Our fifth cross is the one that is suspended with a black cloth. It is suspended and empty. What is the cross that you bear? How can you see that God is walking alongside of you in that cross? When it is time to come down from that cross, God will be there for you. God will carry you to wherever it is that you will go next. We are reminded that this is the ending of the day, and that there will be another day, and there will be a day beyond that. And until then, we keep watch. We keep in our hearts hope and silence and grief and love.